Okay, so no one's going to deny that we're living in some fucked up times right now. Although, thanks to the willful algorithmic polarization of society, enabled by the venal tech bro class, the reasons why we're inhabiting this particular cultural and political hellscape are very different. With one side blaming woke liberal leftists, and the other pointing the finger at conservative, neoconservative, and far right authoritarianism. And in case you're wondering, it's obviously conservative, neoconservative, and far right authoritarianism that's to blame. But what I've been thinking about lately, in between bouts of moral rage and disgust, is what comes after all of this. Once the rabid racists and fascists have tired themselves out from yet another round of kicking and screaming at a world which would rather move on without them and their psychotic hatred dragging us all back down into the mud again and again and again. What do we do to stop this cycle? How do we preclude another authoritarian uprising where state-sanctioned masked militias demand proof of citizenship, terrorise whole communities, and murder people in the street? Because make no mistake, like all the other nationalistic regimes and movements before it, this one will also fall. Probably quite soon in the case of the US, which is so going out of its way to emulate 1930s Nazi Germany that the xenophobic zealots and knuckleheads, cheering it all on from the sides, have even poured the entire foundation of their tenuous New World Order into the single body of an unhinged, unpredictable, deeply insecure whack job. So, what do we do then? When that moment happens, when this depressingly international wave of authoritarianism fails. Our best and only chance to make sure none of us ever have to suffer through this kind of brute violence and repression again is to properly, consciously, and committedly enter a lengthy period of accountability and prevention. And prevention, in fact, begins with accountability. So let's start there. After the insurrection that took place on January the 6th, 2021, when the US Capitol was attacked by a mob of Trump supporters, stirred up by the man himself after refusing to accept he'd lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, instead making wild, unsubstantiated claims that the election had been rigged and encouraging thousands to march on Washington, while a number of the protesters were arrested, later, of course, to be fully pardoned in Trump's second non-consecutive term, Trump himself faced no consequences beyond a bit of toothless censure. This, to my mind, was a result of a combination of two things. One, an odd sense of political decorum where Biden decided it was unseemly to use the Justice Department to go after a political opponent, even though that opponent had literally committed an act of treason by inciting an insurrection. And two, a worry that arresting and putting Trump on trial would create social unrest. It's a pathetic excuse, really, and one that didn't stop Brazil when it came to jailing their own would-be dictator, Jair Bolsonaro, who was sentenced to 27 years in prison by the country's Supreme Court in November 2025 for trying a Trump and plotting a coup of his own after he lost his election. There is a third factor, of course, and it's the one we're going to get into now, which is the unspoken agreement among the higher echelons of the governing class that you just don't hold the very rich and powerful accountable for their crimes and misdemeanours. Or certainly not in the same way the rest of us are held to account. Because the very rich and powerful fund the governing class and their families. And that's to say nothing of the revolving door between career politicians and powerful corporate entities that ensures an ever-present conflict of interest that blocks almost any and every attempt at accountability. It's don't bite the hand that feeds you writ large as technocratic societal policy. So, step one in laying the groundwork for a society in which far-right authoritarianism no longer rears its ugly head is making sure that the very rich and the very powerful are held to account, that they are held to the same standards as the rest of society. Because there is nothing more guaranteed to foment the atmosphere of resentment and anger that authoritarianism feeds on than a palpable sense of unfairness. And it's this unfairness which is almost always pointed at the wrong people. A misdirection willfully encouraged and often instigated by the same very rich and very powerful individuals who would rather the rest of us all tore each other apart than lose a single cent of their hard, unearned money. Utterly destroying that untouchability is paramount. When the Trump regime finally falls, he and his entire administration must be put on trial. They must be convicted of war crimes and imprisoned. In addition, they must have every single one of their assets seized. Not just the wealth that they accumulated through profiteering from their violent tyranny, but everything from before. And watch as all their money is pumped back into the society that they attempted to destroy, and they are left destitute. Similar consequences will face all of those who appeased and collaborated with the Trump regime. Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and all the rest, they gave Trump money. They financed his regime. They financed his war crimes against the citizens of the US, paving the way for Trump's ICE militia of untrained psychopaths to terrorize Minnesota and steal kids off the streets with impunity. And so they must also pay the cost. The owners of Trump's propaganda platforms, they will also be held accountable for fanning the flames of hatred and knowingly spreading misinformation and outright lies. Following massive fines and asset seizures, the companies of these people will be placed in state custody, which, thanks to the law of the US, I think are classed as individuals, since shareholders never have any responsibility and can therefore be arrested as such. These companies will serve out sentences where all profits go to the state. Workers, of course, will still earn their salaries, but no more fat bonuses and vastly bloated and unmerited paychecks for shareholders and CEOs until the prison term is complete. It will be quite the lesson for all those other self-styled masters of the universe who think that their wealth and corporate holdings put them not just above the law, but basic human decency. It must be made very, very clear that their heaving wealth means nothing. Then, once that message has been received loud and clear, the foot soldiers will also face trial. Just following orders will be no defence. Rene Good's murderer will be brought to justice, and countless ICE agents will be put on the stand. Everyone pardoned by Trump, whether family members, ICE agents, January 6 insurrectionists, all of them will have their pardons quashed because pardons issued by convicted dictators have zero legitimacy. A Democrat president could easily do it, thanks to the Trump Supreme Court having essentially given the office unlimited power, because the Trump appointees on its benches are both short-sighted idiots and arrogant fools. Right-wing grifters and influencers will face the same consequences as Fox News. Their podcasts shut down, their social media presences erased. And speaking of social media, the owners of those platforms will be held responsible for everything published on their sites, including health misinformation, hate speech, revenge porn, and so they will need to up their screening game or face being closed down and losing their revenue streams. Also, the use of algorithms designed to increase engagement through anger will be prohibited for the social manipulation that it so very obviously is. There are big questions to ask about the role of tech in a fair society, but that's the subject for a different essay. However, one thing is certain: the likes of Zuckerberg and Musk must be reined in. Musk is an especially egregious example of the intersection between greed and far-right authoritarianism. He is a man, loosely speaking he's a man, who would rather foment fascist fury and bring down democracy just so the government of a country doesn't oblige him and his companies to pay tax or follow regulations because he thinks that his wealth puts him above the law. It's precisely that belief that needs to be quashed once and for all, especially when we see what happens when that kind of power is concentrated in the hands of deranged individuals such as Musk, who incredibly got lost down the algorithmically psychotic rabbit hole of his own platform and radicalized himself. And the eternally venal and congenitally dishonest Trump, the best useful idiot the power brokers orchestrating the modern Nazi movement could ever have hoped to have dangling from their strings. Holding such individuals to account will send a powerful message to their peers and to everyone else about the direction the rest of us want the world to take and about their place in that world. But it can't just all be about accountability and punishment. True prevention of authoritarianism must be embedded fully in the culture and psychology of society, so we never again have to wake up to news of masked men shooting a man to death multiple times for having the temerity to record their brutality on his phone, or shooting a woman in the face because they knew deep down that she was better than them. Doing this requires a three-pronged approach along these trajectories. 1. The introduction of real, full-bodied legislation against bigotry. 2. A wholesale restructuring of economics that fixes the glaring imbalance and injustice of the current model. And 3. Education. Let's begin with the first of those, legislating against hate. Now, of course, the usual voices will pop up to whine about police states and government overreach, but given that their side were out on the street murdering citizens, I think there would certainly be enough popular sentiment to tell those voices, politely, to shut the fuck up. Because here's the thing, there doesn't need to be anything draconian about implementing such laws. The fact is, most people are not murderous psychopaths and insecure man-babies looking to compensate for their own inadequacies by killing anyone whose mere existence reminds them of those inadequacies. Most people are unlikely to kick up a fuss or cause any strife if they are treated with respect and can feed and house their families, rather than be economically neglected. But we'll get to the influence of economics in a bit. The key thing about legislating against bigotry is that it is about no longer tolerating the intolerable. Certainly not out of some sense that it would be wrong to tread on the toes of or somehow be curtailing the freedom of. The kind of people who believe free speech is a license to scream abuse at you or deny you your existence, and who have no compunction about not just treading on our toes, but smashing them with a hammer from the skull down. With all due respect, which is none, fuck that. We see again and again that whenever that space is allowed, the bigots take advantage, wedging it open ever wider with their bile and their poison until we end up with what we've seen happening now on the streets of America under Donald Trump. Thus, we have to crack down on all of that evil shit that somehow always ends up killing us. Far-right ideology, well, honestly, all extreme ideologies, but far-right ideology has to be criminalised. Being part of a neo-Nazi group will be grounds for arrest, as will all hate crimes. A healthy society must take a hard line against bigotry of all kinds, or we will never be rid of it. The consequences of bigotry must far outweigh the expression of it. So, those that preach hate and bigotry must face huge fines, house arrest, limited movement, restricted access to social media, and most crucially, community service. Community service that requires offenders to work with those that they have targeted, vilified, and attacked. In most instances, many of those offenders would themselves be victims of radicalization and manipulation. Working alongside the targets of their abuse will go a long way to deprogramming them of an irrational hatred that was instilled in them purely as a means to keep society divided so that a wealthy, powerful elite could continue hoarding more and more and more resources for themselves. Proximity breaks down barriers. Shared experience and common humanity break through. Relationships develop. The woke libtard endowment slips away to reveal the true person beneath. Circumstance, context, is everything. Living inside a plurality is a very different experience to looking inside one from without, while somebody screams in your ear that it is wrong, evil, and depraved. Prison, or what we understand as some form of state custody, would be reserved only for the very worst cases, for those who still pose a very real physical danger to all the other people simply trying freely to live their lives without judgment or harassment. That even goes for Donald J. Trump, who, yes, we would see every day as he sweeps the streets clean of all our trash. We have seen what bigotry and fascism have wrought, and it will no longer be permitted. If society is driving a car, well, then authoritarianism is driving without a seatbelt. And we have seatbelt laws for a reason. But it's not just enough to legislate against bigotry and hate. You have to create the conditions where bigotry and hate simply cannot thrive. If we look back, we can see time and again that societies get sucked into fascist authoritarian tyrannies when the people in those societies have nothing else, when they are desperate and deprived, angry and frustrated, and convinced of their own powerlessness. If we are to avoid such a state, we must radically alter the way our economies work. We must fix the brutal, glaring economic imbalance between rich and poor. We must do something to repair economics so that it serves all the people and does not allow the neglect and want in which resentment and bigotry fester. Perhaps it sounds glib to say so, but I think people are a lot less likely to rise up in anger when their bellies and their fridges are full. Think about it. You have some kind of work that fulfills you, with people around you who feel the same. You have time and leisure to relax with friends and family, or by yourself. You don't have to struggle to clothe and feed your children, or yourself, and you know that everyone in your community shares those sentiments. Suddenly, it doesn't matter that some of your neighbours have different colour skin, or have different accents. It doesn't matter that Gary and Dave are adopting a kid, or Sandra and Ruthlin are getting married, or 3 doors down, the non-binary polycule is having a barbecue, and you absolutely could not give a single fuck that Melanie was born Mohammed and Peter was born Penny, because why would you? You're comfortable. You have everything you need. There's enough to go around because no one is keeping resources away from you because they believe scarcity is the necessary prerequisite of capitalism, and telling you that everybody different is a threat because that will keep you occupied blaming those who should be your natural allies in the fight against economic injustice. In times of plenty, differences are celebrated, but scarcity feeds division and fuels authoritarianism. This is why the same people who profit from authoritarianism so desperately and forcefully push culture wars instead of fixing anything, having their paid avatars screaming about identity politics and cancel culture from their long-running primetime TV shows. Economic egalitarianism, and therefore the social cohesion that results from it, is a threat to their insatiable greed. It's time to ban billionaires. No single person should be allowed to own so much wealth or exert so much power because of it. In the end, of course, exerting power is all they can do with it. They can't spend it. They have too much of it, so they just hoard it instead, while people die of hunger or sickness or homelessness, convincing themselves that the amounts of zeros that they have in their bank accounts shows how superior they are, how moral they are, how important they are. But that much wealth is poison, as much to those who own it, and for whom it has become an addiction, as to those whose lives are deprived because of the way it has been so unfairly distributed. What kind of effect does it have on the psyche? The intellectual twists and turns a mind must contort itself around, trying to justify wallowing in your undeserved wealth while children starve, not just in the third world, but in your own country, in your own city. Well, I guess one effect is to double down and work to impose a fascist authoritarian state to silence all those voices reminding you that there is no justification. The conclusion is that even the 1% would be better off if the wealth of a nation were more evenly shared out. No one person needs $1 billion or pounds or whatever, and it is a sickness to think otherwise. Regardless of the noises that come from the right-wing press, the mouthpieces and bullhorns of those same rich and powerful individuals who don't want anything to change and who cannot abide even the slightest threat to their heaving fortunes, most people, when the surveys are done on a question-by-question basis, tend, when the subject is one of fairness, towards what we might call economic socialism. By that, I mean that there is a support for social safety nets, free healthcare services, affordable housing and transport infrastructure, and basic fairness when it comes to salaries, especially executive salaries, with some bosses at large firms earning around 250 times more than the average worker below them. Added to that, the fact that basic worker salaries have hardly grown at all over the last 30 years, while seeing top CEO compensation packages rise by more than 1,000%, then we have a massive problem and a hotbed for dissatisfaction and fury. We need to ask serious questions about how we value work and how we value a person's time, and then how we translate those values into currency. If people earn enough to live dignified lives with time for both work and play and quality family and relationship time, then the chances of civil unrest, they lessen. As does the opportunity for certain people to take advantage of that unrest to whip up fascistic movements. But even when you work every hour that you can spare, and you still don't have enough to make ends meet, then something is very, very wrong. If we must insist on using the arbitrary system of money, then the question of access has to be addressed. If only a few people at the top have most of the money, then money itself becomes meaningless, as it no longer serves the majority who do all the labour, the people who keep the cogs of society moving, and thus the whole system collapses. Until we resolve financial disparity, the threat of authoritarianism as a result of economic deprivation will remain as strong as it ever was. How we do that is the subject of another essay. It has to be, given how long this one has gone on, but it is in the pipeline. So let's get to that final path to prevention: education. Education is already a battleground for the future. In the US and elsewhere, we see moves to ban certain books from libraries and schools, to erase subjects such as Black history and gender fluidity, and to wipe national culpability from societal memory. A healthy society does not withhold information from young inquiring minds. But those same authoritarian forces, powered by fear of loss of wealth and power, don't want an informed populace. An informed populace with critical thinking skills and emotional intelligence poses a threat to the balance of power. Which is exactly why young inquiring minds must have access to information, to art and creative expression, to history and to fiction, so that they may learn from the past and perhaps, if we're fortunate, do what so many generations have failed to do so far, and make sure that those mistakes from the past are not repeated. We owe it to the next generation to teach them that authoritarianism is never to be countenanced, that intolerance and fascism will only ever bring them pain and misery. There were vague moves towards this following the Second World War, along with moves towards economic justice and social mobility, but they were all still sadly couched in terms of national exceptionalism and the greatness of empire, and therefore they were built on sand. But then everything became about money again, when in the 80s the rich and powerful got fed up with having to share the wealth fairly, and we entered the epoch of privatization and deregulation, where state schools stopped being places of education and instead became worker bee factories, churning out good little drones to people the machines that would later replace them. The importance of pluralism, diversity, and economic justice must be taught in schools. Their antitheses must be made anathema to future generations, so the rejection of authoritarianism, of fascism and bigotry is visceral, instinctual, turning authoritarianism into a sociological allergen that no amount of epinephrine can quash. The problem is, of course, that the next generation has to be taught by this one. And we're still stuck in the system that money rules, that views wealth and power as aspirational. And not just in terms of education either, but everything I've been talking about: accountability, legislation, income equality. The power systems in control of these social factors are deeply entrenched. Shifting them will take time and patience. But shift them, we must. We're seeing in real time on the streets of Minnesota what happens if we don't. Authoritarianism is an existential threat that needs to be extinguished. The will is there, the means are within reach, and the work has already begun. And yes, it's hard work, but it's also good work. It's the kind of work we all want. It's work that pays a living salary.